Somewhere in the dark, the mind is already running. Not toward anything in particular, not because it wants to be running, simply because running is what it does when the body has stopped and the day has gone quiet, and there is nothing left to occupy it except itself. You may recognize this. The thought about tomorrow that arrives before you have finished the thought about today. The conversation from 3 years ago that surfaces, for no clear reason, just as sleep was almost here. The low, persistent hum of a worry that has no name, only a quality, a texture in the chest that the dark seems to make louder rather than softer. You are not broken. This is not a problem with you. The Buddha noticed this exact thing about his own mind more than 2,000 years ago. He sat with it. He watched it do exactly what your mind is doing tonight. And then he taught about it, plainly and with great kindness, to anyone who would listen. He did not call the wandering mind a failure. He did not call it something to be ashamed of. He named it the way you name a thing you understand completely, and he pointed toward a way through it that did not require the mind to stop. Before we begin, leave one word in the comments tonight. Just one word for what the mind is doing right now. Running, looping, spinning, wandering, whatever is honest. Someone else will arrive here carrying the same word and feel less alone for finding it. If this channel is finding you something worth returning to, the subscribe button is there. It costs nothing. It just means a night like this one will find you again. Now, close your eyes if they are ready. Tonight's stories come from 6 traditions and 9 centuries. A Vietnamese nun who sat with a thought for 3 years before she understood it was not the thought that was the problem. A Tibetan nomad who discovered in the middle of the most difficult winter of his life that the mind is most dangerous when it is left alone with itself. A Japanese ink master whose students came to him with racing thoughts and left carrying a silence they had not brought with them. A Chinese laywoman who kept a small jar of river water on her windowsill for 40 years and understood the mind only when the jar finally settled. A Korean hermit who stopped fighting his own thoughts in his 41st year of practice and discovered what was underneath them. And an old man in a village in Sri Lanka who sat every morning for 60 years with the same difficult thought, and one morning simply did not need to anymore. These stories are contemplative in nature, offered here as a place to breathe, not as medical or therapeutic advice. Simply stories. Simply this. Feel where your body meets whatever is beneath it right now, the specific warmth of it, the weight pressing gently down through the mattress, through the bed, all the way to the floor. You are held here. The mind may be running. The body is here. The stories are waiting. In the mountains of Ha Giang province in the far north of Vietnam, in the late years of the Tran dynasty, in the early part of the 14th century, there was a small convent of nuns attached to the outer edge of a larger Tian Buddhist monastery, separated from the main complex by a bamboo grove and a stone courtyard that collected water in the monsoon months and reflected the sky in the dry ones. The convent housed 7 nuns. It was not famous. No student traveled long distances to study there. The teachings given in its small hall were the same teachings given in 100 other halls across that province. The nuns practiced, worked the small kitchen garden on the southern slope, received the teachings of the senior monk at the main monastery on designated mornings, and lived the quiet, structured life of women who had chosen the Dharma over the lives their families had imagined for them. A nun named Du Huang had been at this convent since her 22nd year. She was, at the time of this story, 45 years old. She had been a practitioner for 23 years. She had kept the precepts without lapse. She had sat in meditation morning and evening without exception. She had received every teaching offered and absorbed each one with the serious attention of someone who came to the practice not as a comfort or a convenience, but as the only thing that made the full weight of being alive bearable. She was not at peace. This was not a secret. The other nuns knew it, in the specific way that people who live in close proximity know the interior weather of those they live with. They did not speak of it. It was not their place to speak of it. But they knew that Du Huang carried something in her that the years of practice had not reached. What she carried was a thought. Not a complicated thought, not a philosophical puzzle or an unresolved doctrinal question. A simple thought, the kind that has no clear origin and no clear destination, that arrives without announcement and stays without permission, that is not attached to any particular event or person, and therefore cannot be addressed by addressing an event or a person. The thought was, "You are not enough." She could not trace it to any moment. It had been present for as long as she could remember. It was present during the formal practice sessions when she sat in the posture and recited, and the thought would arrive underneath the recitation, quieter than the words, but more insistent. It was present during the kitchen work, in the spaces between tasks when the mind was not fully occupied. It was present in the early mornings when the darkness was still complete and the bell had not yet sounded, and the quality of the quiet made the thought louder rather than softer. She had tried everything the tradition offered. She had brought the thought to the senior monk, who had given her a teaching about the nature of self and the illusion of inadequacy, which she understood intellectually and which had not changed anything. She had applied the specific meditation techniques designed for working with persistent mental content. She had increased her formal practice, spending more hours in the sitting posture, believing that quantity of effort would reach what quality had not. Nothing reached it. In the third year of her formal attempt to address the thought, she stopped trying. Not in despair. Something subtler than despair. She was sitting one morning in the hour before the bell, in the complete darkness of the pre-dawn, when she noticed something she had not previously noticed. The thought was present, as it always was, and also present, underneath the thought or perhaps around it, something else. Something that was aware of the thought without being the thought. Something that had been present before the thought arrived that morning and would remain after the thought eventually dissolved. She sat with this awareness for the rest of the morning sitting. The thought continued. She no longer addressed it. She went to the senior monk the following week, not with a question about the thought, but with a different question. She asked, "If I cannot reach the water at the bottom of the well, is the water still there?" The monk was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The water does not depend on your reaching it." She understood. The thought, she came to see, was not an absence of peace. It was a weather condition that arose in the mind the way certain clouds arise in certain seasons. It did not describe the reality of the person. It did not alter what was actually present underneath it. The awareness in which the thought arose was not diminished by the thought, was not defined by the thought, was not the thought. She had been so occupied with the thought that she had not noticed the one doing the noticing. For the remaining decades of her practice, the thought continued to visit. She did not find a way to make it stop. What changed was her relationship to it. The thought arrived. She noticed the thought. She noticed that she was the one noticing, and the one noticing was not the same as the thought. She called this in a conversation she had in her later years with a young novice who had come to ask about difficulties in practice. The difference between the weather and the sky. The weather changes, the sky does not change. The thought is the weather. What you are is the sky. The novice asked, "How do I find the sky?" Ju Huang was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are already in it. That is why you can see the weather." This is the first thing the mind chapter of the Dhammapada offers on a night like this one. Not a method for stopping the thought, not a technique for silencing the weather, something prior to both. The recognition that the awareness in which the thought arises is not the thought, that the sky in which the weather moves is not itself weather, that what is most essential in you is not what the mind is doing tonight. The thought that keeps returning is not the truth of you. It is weather moving through what you actually are. Let your jaw soften now, just a little. Let the forehead smooth, the space between the brows release. The sky does not tighten when clouds arrive. The cloud passes through, the sky remains. And as the mist moves through the bamboo grove outside Diu Huang's convent in the Hajiang Mountains and the morning bell prepares to sound, we travel now northward and westward across the centuries, to the high plateau of Tibet, where a nomad discovered in the worst winter of his life that the mind untended can become its own storm. In the Changtang Plateau of western Tibet, in the late 11th century, at an elevation where the wind in winter came without obstruction from the northwest, and the temperature at night fell to the kind of cold that is not merely uncomfortable, but structurally dangerous to anything warm-blooded, there was a nomadic family whose winter grazing route brought them each year to a particular valley, sheltered on three sides by limestone ridges. The valley was not comfortable in any ordinary sense, but it was survivable. The ridges broke enough of the northwest wind to keep the temperature marginally less lethal than the open plateau. There was dried scrub grass enough for the animals under the snow if you knew where to look. There was a spring that did not freeze until the deepest weeks of the season, because it emerged from the rock at a temperature slightly above what would cause it to stop. A man named Sonam Rinchen, the second son of the family, had made this winter journey 14 times. He was 36 years old. He knew the route, the valley, the spring, the places where the snow drifted, and the places where the wind scoured the ground clear. In the 15th year, something went wrong. Not with the route. Not with the weather, which was severe, but within the range of what the family had survived before. What went wrong was with Sonam Rinchen's mind. The winter had brought with it a grief that the previous 14 winters had not carried. His eldest son, a boy of 12 who had been healthy and present and real in the specific way that children are real to parents, had died in the autumn of a fever that the region's medicine could not address. The death had been rapid. The rapid quality of it had not made it easier. It had made it stranger. 1 week the boy was alive. The following week he was not. Sonam Rinchen had done what the community around him understood. He had grieved. The community had supported the grief in the ways available to nomadic communities on the Changtang Plateau in the 11th century, which were real and present if not elaborate. He had performed the necessary rites. He had kept the necessary practices. And then the winter migration had begun, and they had moved as they always moved, and the plateau had opened around them in its winter face, and they had made their way to the valley as they always made their way. The mind, however, had not moved on. During the long days of travel, when the work of keeping the animals moving through the snow required enough physical attention to partially occupy the mind, it was manageable. In the evenings, when the family gathered in the tent, and the butter lamps were lit, and the tea was prepared, and there were voices, and warmth, and the immediate practical demands of the night camp, it was manageable. In the nights, It was not manageable. He lay on his sleeping mat, in the dark of the tent, and the mind did what it did. It returned to the boy, to the specific morning the fever had begun, to the days of the illness and the small decisions he had made, the ones he now turned over, endlessly looking for the place where a different decision would have led to a different outcome. To the face of the boy on the last morning, to the weight of the boy in his arms before they carried him to the place of sky burial. He turned all of it over, night after night, in the specific way that grief does when it is allowed to run without interruption in the dark hours. By the 6th week of the winter camp, he was not sleeping in the way that the body requires. He was lying still, but the mind was running continuously, and the running of the mind was beginning to cost the body in ways that the work of the camp required he could not afford. There was a teacher, not in the valley, a 2-day journey north, in a cave hermitage on the far side of a ridge. There was a practitioner of the Kagyu tradition who had been there for years and who was known in the communities that moved through that region of the plateau as someone whose understanding of the mind's suffering was genuine rather than theoretical. Sonam Rinchen made the journey in the worst week of the winter. He arrived at the cave after 2 days of travel, in conditions that the teacher, who had been watching the approach for the last hour from the cave entrance, described later as the kind of conditions that only a very desperate person or a very foolish one would choose to travel in. Sonam Rinchen was, the teacher said, obviously the former. He was brought in, he was given tea, he was warmed, he slept for most of a day. When he woke, the teacher was sitting near the small fire. He did not immediately ask what had brought the man from the valley in such weather. He waited. Eventually, Sonam Rinchen spoke. He described the nights, the mind running, the turning over of the same events, the same decisions, the same last morning, the way the running seemed to intensify in the dark, the way the cold of the plateau outside the tent seemed to make it worse rather than better. The teacher was quiet for a long time after the man finished. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge above the cave with the sound of something very large moving very fast. Then the teacher said, "Tell me, when your mind goes back to that morning, what does it expect to find?" Sonam Rinchen did not immediately understand the question. The teacher said, "Every time you return to that morning in your mind, you go back as if something might be different this time, as if the returning itself might change what is there. But the morning is fixed. The morning is the same each time you visit it. What is the mind looking for that it keeps returning to find?" The man was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think it is looking for the place where I could have done something different." "Yes," said the teacher. "And is that place there?" He was quiet again. Then, slowly, "No." The teacher said, "So the mind is walking a road that ends in the same place every time. Not because the road is wrong, because the destination is fixed. The boy is gone. The morning is over. The decisions are made. The road ends there every time, and the mind cannot accept the ending, and so it turns around and walks the road again, hoping this time the ending will be different." He looked at the man across the fire. "This is not grief," he said. "Grief is real. Grief is the work of love, releasing what it cannot keep. What you are doing in the nights is something different. You are walking a road that ends in the same wall, again and again, and striking the wall each time, as if this time it might give way." Sonam Rinchen sat with this for a long time. The wind continued outside. Then he said, "How do I stop walking the road?" The teacher said, "You stop expecting the ending to change. Not because the ending does not matter, because accepting the ending is the only way to stop striking the wall. The boy is gone. That is the ending. Every return to the road is another striking of the wall. The grief of his absence is real. The wall is real. The striking is what you can choose to put down. He paused. Then he said, more quietly, "You cannot think your way back to him, but you can think your way to rest." Sonam Rinchen returned to his family's camp after 3 days. The nights did not immediately become easy. The mind continued to return to the road, continued to walk toward the wall. But now when it returned, he recognized what it was doing. He had a name for it. And naming a thing, as the teacher understood and as Sonam Rinchen slowly understood, changes the relationship to the thing. The named thought is something you can see. The thought you cannot name is something you are inside without knowing it. Slowly, across the remaining weeks of the winter, the nightly road became less urgent. Not because the grief diminished, because the mind had stopped expecting the ending to change. This is what the wandering mind does in the dark, when it is in pain. It walks the same road to the same wall, and strikes the wall and turns around and walks the road again. Not from stubbornness, from the specific desperation of love that cannot accept its ending. If there is a road the mind has been walking tonight, returning again and again to the same place, arriving at the same fixed ending, the teacher's question is available to you now. What does the mind expect to find when it returns? If the answer is a different ending, the wall is real and the ending will not change. The road can be set down tonight. Not the grief, not the love that the grief is made of. Just the expecting of a different ending from a road that ends where it always ends. Let the breath be long now on the exhale, slow and complete. Let the mind that has been walking be simply still for one breath, just one. The road will be there in the morning if it is needed. Tonight, just one breath of not walking. And as the wind moves across the limestone ridge above the cave hermitage on the Changtang Plateau and the fire inside burns low, we travel now eastward and forward 2 centuries, to Japan, where an ink master received students who came with racing thoughts and discovered that what they needed was not what they had come for. In the city of Kamakura, in the late years of the Kamakura period, in the early 14th century, when the Zen tradition in Japan was still establishing the particular forms it would take in that country, distinct from but growing from the Chinese Chan from which it had been transmitted, there was a painter named Muso Joshin, who was not famous as a teacher of the Dharma, but who had, over 3 decades of practice and work, developed a quality in his presence that students of several different teachers in the city came to seek without always being able to explain why. He worked in ink. Not the elaborate tradition of Buddhist iconographic painting that the formal monastery workshops produced. The simpler, older tradition of monochrome ink work in which a single brushstroke, executed with the right quality of attention, could carry more meaning than a fully rendered scene executed with effort and deliberation. His studio was a single room. It faced north, which was unusual, because northern light was flat and unflattering to most forms of work. Muso Joshin chose it specifically because the flat northern light did not flatter. It showed exactly what was there without enhancement. The work either held in flat northern light or it did not hold, and he had no interest in work that required favorable lighting to be what it was. Students came to him not to learn painting. They came because their teachers had, in some cases, suggested it, and because word had spread in the specific way that word spreads among serious practitioners of any tradition, that something happened in his studio that was difficult to name, but that was connected in some important way to what they were struggling with in their practice. What most of them struggled with was what you are struggling with tonight. The mind that would not stop. They would come to him in the late afternoon, after the formal practice sessions of the day, carrying the quality of someone who has been trying very hard for a long time without arriving anywhere. The slightly hollow look of sustained effort. The eyes that were attending too hard to everything. Muso Joshin would receive them without ceremony. He would offer tea. He would ask them, eventually, what had brought them. They would describe, in various ways, the same thing. The thoughts that came during meditation and would not go. The worries that arrived at night and stayed past the hour when they should have dissolved. The sense that the mind was running continuously and that no effort had been able to slow it. He would listen to all of this without interruption. Then he would pick up a brush. He would prepare the ink with the specific quality of attention that the preparation of ink requires, which is unhurried and present in a way that formal effort is not. He would hold the brush above the paper for a period of time that was, for the watching student, uncomfortably long. Nothing happening. Brush above paper. The student beginning to wonder if something was wrong. And then the stroke. One stroke. A single line, or the suggestion of a branch, or the arc of a bird's wing, incomplete. Whatever the stroke was, it was complete in itself. It did not require another stroke to be finished. It ended where it ended, and the space around it was part of the work. He would set the brush down. He would look at the paper. Then he would look at the student. He would say, "Tell me what you saw." The student would describe the stroke, the speed of it, the weight of the ink, the way it tapered at the end. He would say, "And what did you hear?" The student would be confused. Here, they had heard the brush on the paper, a soft sound, the sound of wet ink on a slightly resistant surface. He would say, "And in between the moment I lifted the brush and the moment the brush touched the paper?" Silence, the student would say. "Yes," he would say, "and in the silence, where was your mind?" The students, almost uniformly, reported the same experience. In the silence before the stroke, the mind had been simply present. Not running, not planning, not worrying. Simply waiting, in the way that the whole room waited, for the stroke that would break the silence. He would say, "That is the mind you came here to find. It was there the entire time, not requiring effort, requiring only something to wait for that was real enough to hold the full attention." This is the teaching from the Flatlit studio in Kamakura. The mind that will not stop is not a mind that needs to be forced to stop. It is a mind that has not found anything real enough to be fully present to. The stroke of the brush was real. The silence before it was real. The waiting in that silence was real. And in the reality of the waiting, the running ceased without effort. Not because anyone stopped it, because something more immediate than the running was present. What is most immediate right now is this, the breath, which is real. The specific weight of the body against the surface beneath it, which is real. The particular quality of this darkness at this hour, which is real and will not be this exact quality again. The mind that is running towards something it believes is more real than this. It is not. The breath is more real than tomorrow's meeting. The body is more real than the conversation from 3 years ago. The darkness of this specific hour is more real than any thought moving through it. Let the brush rest on the paper of this moment. Let the stroke have been made. There is nothing to add. And as the ink dries in the flat northern light of Muso Joshin's studio, and the student carries the silence home through the evening streets of Kamakura, we travel now westward across the water and forward 1 century, to China, where a laywoman kept a jar of river water on her windowsill for 40 years and understood the mind only when the jar finally settled. In the mountains of Ha Giang province, in the far north of Vietnam, in the late years of the Tran dynasty, in the early part of the 14th century, there was a small convent of nuns attached to the outer edge of a larger Tian Buddhist monastery, separated from the main complex by a bamboo grove and a stone courtyard that collected water in the monsoon months and reflected the sky in the dry ones. The convent housed 7 nuns. It was not famous. No student traveled long distances to study there. The teachings given in its small hall were the same teachings given in 100 other halls across that province. The nuns practiced, worked the small kitchen garden on the southern slope, received the teachings of the senior monk at the main monastery on designated mornings, and lived the quiet, structured life of women who had chosen the Dharma over the lives their families had imagined for them. A nun named Du Huang had been at this convent since her 22nd year. She was, at the time of this story, 45 years old. She had been a practitioner for 23 years. She had kept the precepts without lapse. She had sat in meditation morning and evening without exception. She had received every teaching offered and absorbed each one with the serious attention of someone who came to the practice not as a comfort or a convenience, but as the only thing that made the full weight of being alive bearable. She was not at peace. This was not a secret. The other nuns knew it, in the specific way that people who live in close proximity know the interior weather of those they live with. They did not speak of it. It was not their place to speak of it. But they knew that Du Huang carried something in her that the years of practice had not reached. What she carried was a thought. Not a complicated thought, not a philosophical puzzle or an unresolved doctrinal question. A simple thought, the kind that has no clear origin and no clear destination, that arrives without announcement and stays without permission, that is not attached to any particular event or person, and therefore cannot be addressed by addressing an event or a person. The thought was, "You are not enough." She could not trace it to any moment. It had been present for as long as she could remember. It was present during the formal practice sessions, when she sat in the posture and recited, and the thought would arrive underneath the recitation, quieter than the words, but more insistent. It was present during the kitchen work, in the spaces between tasks, when the mind was not fully occupied. It was present in the early mornings, when the darkness was still complete and the bell had not yet sounded, and the quality of the quiet made the thought louder rather than softer. She had tried everything the tradition offered. She had brought the thought to the senior monk, who had given her a teaching about the nature of self and the illusion of inadequacy, which she understood intellectually and which had not changed anything. She had applied the specific meditation techniques designed for working with persistent mental content. She had increased her formal practice, spending more hours in the sitting posture, believing that quantity of effort would reach what quality had not. Nothing reached it. In the 3rd year of her formal attempt to address the thought, she stopped trying. Not in despair. Something subtler than despair. She was sitting one morning in the hour before the bell, in the complete darkness of the pre-dawn, when she noticed something she had not previously noticed. The thought was present, as it always was, and also present, underneath the thought or perhaps around it, something else. Something that was aware of the thought without being the thought. Something that had been present before the thought arrived that morning and would remain after the thought eventually dissolved. She sat with this awareness for the rest of the morning sitting. The thought continued. She no longer addressed it. She went to the senior monk the following week, not with a question about the thought, but with a different question. She asked, "If I cannot reach the water at the bottom of the well, is the water still there?" The monk was quiet for a long time. Then he said, The water does not depend on your reaching it. She understood. The thought she came to see was not an absence of peace. It was a weather condition that arose in the mind the way certain clouds arise in certain seasons. It did not describe the reality of the person. It did not alter what was actually present underneath it. The awareness in which the thought arose was not diminished by the thought, was not defined by the thought, was not the thought. She had been so occupied with the thought that she had not noticed the one doing the noticing. For the remaining decades of her practice, the thought continued to visit. She did not find a way to make it stop. What changed was her relationship to it. The thought arrived. She noticed the thought. She noticed that she was the one noticing, and the one noticing was not the same as the thought. She called this in a conversation she had in her later years with a young novice who had come to ask about difficulties in practice, the difference between the weather and the sky. The weather changes, the sky does not change. The thought is the weather. What you are is the sky. The novice asked, "How do I find the sky?" Ju Huang was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are already in it. That is why you can see the weather." This is the first thing the mind chapter of the Dhammapada offers on a night like this one. Not a method for stopping the thought, not a technique for silencing the weather, something prior to both. The recognition that the awareness in which the thought arises is not the thought, that the sky in which the weather moves is not itself weather, that what is most essential in you is not what the mind is doing tonight. The thought that keeps returning is not the truth of you. It is weather moving through what you actually are. Let your jaw soften now, just a little. Let the forehead smooth, the space between the brows release. The sky does not tighten when clouds arrive. The cloud passes through, the sky remains. And as the mist moves through the bamboo grove outside Diu Huang's convent in the Hajiang Mountains and the morning bell prepares to sound, we travel now northward and westward across the centuries, to the high plateau of Tibet, where a nomad discovered in the worst winter of his life that the mind untended can become its own storm. In the Jiri mountain range in the southern provinces of Korea, in the early years of the Joseon period, in the late 14th century, when the new dynasty was establishing itself and the relationship between the Confucian-influenced court and the Buddhist institutions was becoming more complicated than it had been under the previous Goryeo kings, there was a hermit named Seoam, who had been practicing alone in a cave on the mountain's eastern slope for 41 years. He had entered the cave in his 23rd year, following a period of intensive training at a Seon monastery in the Gyeonggi region. His teacher had certified him as ready for solitary retreat. He had come to the Jiri range because the mountain was known among practitioners of that period as a place where the conditions for extended solitary practice were as good as anywhere on the peninsula. The cave was large enough, the water source was reliable. The local community in the valley below had a tradition of supporting forest practitioners that was old enough to be reflexive. He intended to stay 3 years. He had stayed 41. Not because he was unable to leave, because each time the period of intended retreat ended and he assessed his practice and considered leaving, the assessment revealed something unfinished, something still requiring the specific conditions of solitude to address, and he stayed. By his 64th year, he was a figure of considerable informal reputation in the surrounding region. Practitioners from distant monasteries made pilgrimages to the Jiri range to sit briefly in his presence. He did not seek this out, he did not discourage it. He received those who came with the natural courtesy of someone who has long since made peace with the visits and the solitude equally. His practice in those 41 years had been, from the outside, exemplary. He had maintained the schedule. He had worked the visualizations and the mantra recitations and the inquiry practices of the Seon tradition with the consistency that long solitude supports. He had produced, by his own account in later conversations, something he described as reasonable clarity in the daylight hours of formal practice. The nights were different. He had never discussed this with anyone. There was no one to discuss it with in the early decades, and by the time visitors began to come, the pattern was so old and so established that he had largely stopped noticing it the way one stops noticing a familiar sound. In the nights, the mind ran. Not in the dramatic way of a mind tormented by fear or grief or guilt, simply in the ceaseless manner of a mind left alone in the dark, with nothing to attend to. It moved from memory to speculation to concern to memory again, touching each lightly and moving on, never settling, never arriving. He had fought this for 40 years, not dramatically. The fighting was internal and quiet, the same fighting that practitioners everywhere recognize. The noticing of the thought, the attempt to release the thought, the noticing that the attempt had itself become a thought, the frustration with the noticing. The standard cycle. He had been cycling through it every night for 40 years. In the 41st year, on a night in late autumn, when the wind in the Jiri range was already carrying the cold of the coming winter, and the leaves on the lower slopes were at the peak of their turning, he lay on his sleeping mat, and the mind began its customary running, and he did something he had never done before. He agreed with it. Not a dramatic agreement. Simply the internal equivalent of setting down a weight he had been carrying so long he had forgotten he was carrying it. He said to the mind, without words, "You can run. I am not going to fight tonight." The mind ran. He lay there and let it run. After a time, something he had not expected began to happen. The running, meeting no resistance, lost some of its urgency. Not all of it. The thoughts continued to arrive. But the quality of their arrival changed slightly. They were no longer arriving against a background of resistance that made them louder than they needed to be. They were arriving against a background of space, and in the space they were smaller, less insistent, more clearly what they actually were: thoughts. Just thoughts. Not the emergency they had seemed when they were being fought. Not the problem they had represented when every night he had been trying to solve them and failing. Just thoughts, arising and passing in the darkness of a cave on a mountain in the 14th century, as thoughts had been arising and passing in human minds for as long as there had been human minds to arise and pass in. He lay there for what felt like a long time, simply allowing the running. At some point, he noticed something else. Underneath the running, or perhaps in the spaces between the thoughts as they passed, something he had been too occupied with the fighting to notice before. A quality of stillness that was not the stillness he had been trying to achieve, not the achieved stillness of a practice that has successfully suppressed its material. The stillness that is simply present when the suppression stops. He lay there in it. The thoughts continued for a time. Then, without any intervention, they slowed. The body, finding no resistance in him, no argument to continue on his behalf, found its own way to sleep. In the morning he sat to practice, and the practice was different. Not because anything in the formal structure had changed, because the person sitting had set down something the night before that he had not picked up again. He continued to practice for many more years in that cave. The nights were not always easy. The thoughts continued to arrive. But he had understood something about their nature that changed his relationship to them permanently. The thought is not the enemy. The fighting of the thought is what keeps the thought alive past its natural span. A thought met with resistance becomes something to argue with, something that feels important enough to argue with. A thought met with space simply moves through and is followed by another thought and then another, until the stream slows of its own accord into the stillness that was always underneath it. Tonight the mind may be running. You can fight it. You have probably been fighting it. Or you can say to it what the Hermit said in his 41st year. You can run. I am not going to fight tonight. And the running, meeting no resistance, will do what it naturally does. It will slow. Not all at once, not on demand, in its own time. The way the river water in the jar settled in its own time when Chen Yu-ying stopped stirring it. Let the thoughts run now. Let them. They are not emergencies. They are weather in the sky that Ju Huang understood. Weather moves, sky remains. Let the body be heavy now, the weight of someone who has put down a fight. The floor beneath you is holding everything. You do not need to hold anything tonight. And as the autumn wind moves through the Jiri range above the Hermit's cave, and the turning leaves drop from the lower slopes in the dark, we come now to our last story, southward to Sri Lanka, where an old man sat every morning for 60 years with the same difficult thought, and one morning simply did not need to anymore. In a village in the hill country of central Sri Lanka, in the district that the Pali texts sometimes refer to by a name that translates as the place of the mango groves, there was an elder named Mahinda Thera, a lay practitioner who had been sitting in meditation each morning before the sun fully cleared the eastern ridge for 60 years. He was, at the time of this story, 82 years old. He had been practicing since his 22nd year. He had kept the precepts of a lay Buddhist practitioner with the consistency of someone for whom the precepts were not a discipline, but simply the shape of the life he preferred to live. He had attended the teachings at the local monastery with the regularity of rain in the monsoon season. He had done all of this quietly, without drawing attention to himself, in the specific way that certain practitioners move through long lives of practice without becoming notable, their depth visible only to those who happen to sit near them long enough to notice. And every morning for 60 years the same thought had come. It was not, by external measure, a remarkable thought. It was not a thought about violence or loss or betrayal. It was a thought about a decision he had made in his 31st year, 9 years into his practice. A decision that had seemed necessary at the time, and that had affected someone he cared about in a way he had not intended, and had not been able to fully repair. The decision itself was long past. The person it had affected had lived a full life, and had died many years ago, having, as far as Mahinda Thera knew, come to terms with what had happened between them. The damage, such as it was in the historical past. And yet every morning for 60 years, the thought returned. He had practiced with it the way a practitioner practices with persistent mental content. He had brought it to the cushion and sat with it, acknowledging it, not suppressing it, allowing it to be present and to pass. He had applied the formal practices around it. He had brought it to teachers over the years, who had given him the appropriate teachings about karma, about the nature of regret, about the Buddhist understanding of past actions and their consequences. None of this had made the thought stop returning. He had not been in agony over this for 60 years. He was a person of genuine equanimity, developed over a long practice. The thought's return each morning was more like the arrival of a familiar and not particularly welcome acquaintance than like the repeated wounding of an open injury. He received it. He sat with it. Eventually it passed. He continued his practice. The day proceeded. On a morning in his 82nd year, a morning in the dry season when the air was very clear and the mango trees in the grove east of his house were producing their first fruit of the season, and the quality of the early morning light was the specific luminous quality of Sri Lankan dry season mornings, he sat to practice as he had sat every morning for 60 years. The thought did not come. He noticed its absence the way you notice the absence of a sound that has been continuous for so long that the silence it leaves is strange. He sat with the absence for a while. He waited, in a mild and unattached way, to see if the thought would arrive late. It did not arrive. He sat with the practice that remained, the breath and the awareness, and the specific quality of the morning filtering through the leaves of the mango trees outside. The practice without the thought was, he noted, not substantially different from the practice with the thought. Both were simply sitting. Both were simply being present to what was present. The thought did not return that morning. It did not return the following morning. It did not return again. He was not, he said later, in one of the rare conversations he had with the young monk from the monastery who had been in the habit of visiting him in his later years, particularly surprised. He had understood, from the teachings he had received over 60 years, that this was how such things resolved, not through effort. Through the slow, accumulated weight of having sat with them, morning after morning, without fighting them and without feeding them, until the energy that sustained them was simply exhausted. The thought had been sustained, all those years, by the small amount of attention he gave it each morning when it arrived. Not a large amount, not an anguished amount, simply the amount that a visitor receives when you open the door and offer them tea. That amount of attention, given consistently over 60 years, had been enough to keep the visitor returning. When he had stopped offering the tea, not dramatically, not through any decision, simply through the gradual diminishment of available attention that comes with the fullness of a long practice, the visitor had eventually stopped coming. The young monk asked him, "If you had known this at 22, would you have practiced differently?" Mahindathera was quiet for a while. The mango trees moved in a small breeze. A bird landed in the upper branches and departed again. Then he said, "I would not have fought the thought. I would have been kinder to it from the beginning, kinder to it and kinder to myself for having it." He paused. Then he said, "But perhaps the 60 years were the kindness. Perhaps you cannot be kind to a thought in one morning. Perhaps it requires many mornings." He looked at the young monk with the particular quality of someone who has nothing left to prove. "I had 60 years, he said. "You have whatever you have. Begin with this morning." This is the teaching from the mango grove in the hill country of Sri Lanka. The thought you are carrying tonight is not a permanent condition. It is a visitor who has been receiving just enough attention to continue visiting, not because you are feeding it intentionally, because you are alive and the mind gives attention to what is present. The thought will continue to visit for as long as it visits. Fighting it gives it the energy of conflict. Feeding it gives it the energy of attention. Simply sitting with it, morning after morning, night after night, giving it the simple, quiet acknowledgement that it has arrived without the drama of fighting or the warmth of welcome, is how it eventually runs out of reason to return. You have tonight. Begin with tonight. Let the thought be here if it is here. You do not have to fight it. You do not have to solve it. You do not have to make it leave. You only have to sit beside it the way Mahindathera sat beside his thought for 60 years, quietly, without adding to it, without asking it to be different. And one morning or one night, when you have forgotten you were sitting with it, it will simply not be there. The mango trees continue. The morning light continues. The breath continues. Let the eyes close now, completely. Let the darkness behind the eyelids be simply darkness, soft and complete and requiring nothing. We have traveled a long way together tonight, to the mountain convent in Vietnam, where a nun discovered that the sky does not become the weather that moves through it. To the Tibetan plateau, where a nomad learned that the mind walking the same road to the same wall is not grief, but the refusing of an ending. To the Ink Master's studio in Kamakura, where students with racing thoughts discovered in the silence before a single brushstroke the mind they had been looking for. To the windowsill in Hangzhou, where a laywoman kept river water for 40 years and learned that clarity does not need to be added, only allowed. To the Hermit's cave on Jiri Mountain, where 40 years of fighting the thoughts ended in a single night of agreement. And to the mango grove in Sri Lanka, where an old man sat with the same thought for 60 years, until one morning it simply did not come. 6 traditions, 9 centuries, 6 different forms of the same recognition. The mind that will not stop tonight is not broken. It is doing what minds do. It has always been doing what minds do. And underneath what minds do, always present, never disturbed by any of it, is the sky in which all of this weather moves. Let the names dissolve now. Diu Huang, Sonam Rinchen, Muso Joshin, Chen Yuying, Sewam, Mahinda Thera. Let the stories return to the silence they came from. What remains is what was always here. The breath, which has been moving through every thought tonight without once asking the thoughts to stop. The body, which has been resting through every story, growing heavier by the minute, doing exactly what it knows how to do. The darkness, which has been holding all of it without any effort at all. The thoughts may still be moving. Let them move. You are the sky. The sky does not tighten when clouds arrive. If sleep is reaching for you now, let it come. You do not need to stay awake for any of this. The stories will find you wherever you are. The mind that has been running will find its own way to rest when the body is ready. Trust the body. It has been getting this right every night of your life. Just this, just the breath, arriving without your help. Just the darkness, soft and patient and complete. The mind will quiet when it is ready. You are already home. Good night. I want to say something before you go. I make this channel because I know what it is to lie in the dark with a mind that will not stop. The teachers in tonight's stories spent lifetimes learning what they eventually had to say about it. I try to bring what they found into the hours when you need it most. If tonight gave you one breath of space between you and the running, I am genuinely glad. Leave one word in the comments if you feel like it. Just one word for what the mind was doing tonight. Someone will read it and feel less alone. And if the quiet Dharma is something you want to find again, the subscribe button is there. It costs nothing. It just means the next time a night like this one comes, this will be waiting. Sleep well. The sky does not change with the weather. Good night.